patterns, and that is vulnerability. And so that is why I'm talking about it, because I'm being vulnerable by speaking about it, because I'm not a very emotional person. I don't like talking about feelings, but I'm so convinced from what I have learned on my relatively short time here, that nothing that we hear or talk about at this conference is going to impact our marriage strongly if we don't go into it with vulnerability. And so usually it's something that is talked about, and there's a little video I'm going to show you, a short video when I'm done talking here, that is talking about from the man's perspective a little bit more. But usually you hear about like men not wanting to be vulnerable, but I found it to be, kind of across the board, and something that has been a challenge for me. I said that I'm not a super emotional person. For somehow I got it in my head, and my parents were really good at teaching me that my emotions should not control me. I should not have, and that's true, and I believe that. But I somehow changed it to don't show emotions, because it's, weak. It's not just weak, but it's wishy-washy, all that kind of stuff. And I took this into my life. I also had, a combination of, I was a firstborn. I was this height by the time I was 11 years old. So now I'm pretty average height, but I was huge. I was a giant. Everybody thought, my dad was a pastor. As Justin mentioned, I was a pastor's kid. So, and I was, out of all the staff at our church, I was the only teenager. Everybody else had little kids. So it was really a weird phenomenon. People thought I was older than I was and treated me that way. And I don't know if anybody has had that similar experience, but I babysat a ton growing up. And I even had people that I babysat for regularly. I'd have the parents asking me for not only parenting advice, but marital advice sometimes. It was really weird. So I got into this habit of, feeling like I needed to have answers for people and being responsible, and kind of a coping mechanism of putting everything in its box. You have to answer. But as time went on, as I grew in age and learned new things just living on this earth, I realized that, more and more that things, especially with pastoring and ministry, and if you work with people at any capacity, that it can be very frustrating if anyone else has a similar personality, that you can't put these things. Things are messy, and I don't like messy things. I don't like to be uncomfortable. I like to have an answer to make everybody comfortable again. And it's possibly one of the things that is so frustrating to people that are hurting when they encounter somebody like me that tries to. So I've grown in that and tried to learn to be comfortable with the mess, which is what vulnerability is. I mean, kind of an example is, even in school, I could do algebra all day, but geometry, and I even had a teacher that just pinpointed me. She's like, I know what you're thinking. Why the theorems for geometry, when you had to write, did you guys ever have to do that? You write all these theorems to prove. Well, any idiot can see that line A is equal to line B. Why am I writing theorems? With algebra, there's a question, you put in a certain formula, and you get a certain answer. and so I always like to do that. So I got very, it threw me off. And like Justin spoke about, I would stuff things, sometimes, just to not deal with it, and not have to deal with that emotion of the big things of life. But actually, I learned that, all the things that are wonderful and big and impactful and make a difference all come about by big emotion and messiness. You have to be willing to go through that. And one of the things that, to be vulnerable, no part of our marriage is ever going to be lived wholeheartedly if we can't be vulnerable with each other. And over the years, we used to lead a young adults group in Portland, and we do we'd meet on the first Fridays of the month and we'd show TED Talks. And I really liked some of the TED Talks because I thought, man, so many of these experts that have studied things for years and years and years, and even if some of them weren't Christians, they line up with biblical principles. They're like, yeah, we don't know why. We studied people, we studied data for 20 years and found out that if you do this, this happens. And I'm like, if you read your Bible, you would have known that without studying that for 20 years. It's a biblical principle. But one of the TED Talks that we showed was one by Brene Brown, who a lot of people probably know who that is. She's a psychologist, and she's an analyst. She analyzes data, researcher. And so she did a TED Talk about the power of vulnerability. And so she had done years of research on human connection, is what her study thing was wanting to. So I'm going to share a lot of things that she found in that study, which was really feeling a sense of love and belonging. And we are neurologically wired to want that. It's part of our makeup, is to feel belonging, to feel love, and especially with our spouse, right? That's what we want. But the thing when she was studying these people that, felt human connection and didn't feel human connection, was the thing that unraveled it all for the people that didn't was shame. And it really is. That was the thing for me too, is there's something, I was so used to being like the responsible one, the one that had the answers. So is there something about me that if people knew it, if they saw this thing about me, would make me not worthy of connection, right? That is the thing that keeps us from being vulnerable and sharing with people in our lives, even our spouses sometimes. Everybody has shame in some way, shape, or form. Everybody has it. Nobody wants to talk about it. The less we talk about it, the more we have. Usually, the stronger it is. And she found that the main counterbalance behind that voice of shame saying that I'm not good enough, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not well-versed enough, I'm not, educated enough, I'm whatever it is, I'm not enough. The only thing that counterbalanced it is excruciating vulnerability. And I had this picture that I have Morgan put up because it just is what this is why I say excruciating. It is literally like you're opening yourself up and exposing your heart. If you're doing that, anything can happen to it, right? Being vulnerable means you're exposing yourself without knowing what the outcome's going to be, right? So the huge difference between the people that had a sense of worthiness or a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who struggle with it and are always wondering if they're good enough, that was the people with a strong sense of love and belonging. They believed that they were worth love and belonging. That was the difference. That was the main difference. So it's the main thing that keeps us out of real connection, even with each other, is that fear that we're not worthy of connection. It's the one thing. I mean, and I've struggled with this in my marriage with Justin. I think, like he talked about us being married really young, and I was a pastor's kid, and he came from a lot of brokenness. And I think one of the assumptions that we made, and I'm sure people will talk about assumptions, Les and Leslie Parrott have a lot of good books about assumptions that we make, pre-assumptions before we get married. But I think he thought that, I knew a lot more than I did because I was a pastor's kid, right? And I'd had everything good life. And so, I had taken on that persona. So when things weren't like we expected, like Justin brought up expectations, right? We expected things to be one way and they're not, so we're disappointed. And then instead of talking about it, I would just learn how to cope with that disappointment. And it was actually Justin, and oftentimes I've heard it's the wife that's the one that brings things to a head, but Justin is way better at that than I am. So after, a few years of him, thinking that I'm the person that's going to bring it up to this level because I've come from this Christian background and all this stuff, he decided, that it's not worth it to him. Like he said, if you're going to decide, am I going to live the rest of my life like this, or am I going to risk being hurt to have an awesome marriage? And so he would bring stuff up, and it is so hard for me to put myself out there and show that I was disappointed for fear of rejection, to put myself out there and say that this actually hurts me, because it seems like I'm weak, right, if I say that hurts me, or to say that I actually believe something different than you believe, instead of just keeping it to myself and getting bitter about it. And so the reason, it sounds like a heavy subject, but I really believe it's the key to breakthrough in our marriage, because we're going to talk about, and Danny and Jamie are going to talk about communication, and they're going to talk about conflict, and they're going to talk about intimacy, and all of this stuff. And if we're not willing to be vulnerable with each other, that's only going to take us so slowly on that path of getting there. And let me tell you, and I think they mentioned this in the video, but it's true, the times that you're most vulnerable and most open with each other, despite risking being hurt, is the times you're going to have the best intimacy in your marriage too. It's going to be your best sex ever, because you can trust each other, right? You've put that out there. And let me just say too, being the person, sometimes I'm not good on the receiving side of vulnerability, because if Justin tells me something that, his missed expectations or what hurts him, then I can take that, internalize it, and I feel like I'm a failure. Oh, so you're saying our marriage is a failure. You're saying I am a wife is a failure. And that's just turning it back around and internalizing that shame again, instead of being, hey, my husband loves me, or my wife, whoever it is, loves me so much, wants the best for us so much that they're willing to be vulnerable with. And sometimes it's, it's not just their hurt and pain. Sometimes it's sins, or, something that they're dealing with. But going back to Brene Brown's study, she went to search, what is the thing that these people that live, she called it wholeheartedly. They live wholeheartedly, and they have this connection with other people. And there was 3 things that they had that she put up there. They had courage, which, not to be confused with bravery. The original meaning of courage came from the Latin word cur, and it meant, which means heart. So the original meaning of courage meant to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart, whether that's imperfect, not there, and then have the compassion to be kind to themselves and to other people, because if we can never learn how to be kind to ourselves, we are never going to be that with other people. And then connection comes as a result of authenticity. So they were willing to let go of who they thought they should be, or who they thought society thought they should be, or who your spouse thinks you think your spouse thinks you should be, to be who you really are. And the difference about them, so they fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that being vulnerable, what made them vulnerable was what made them beautiful, what vulnerability, and it was interesting because to me, and I put that picture up there first, it's excruciating. But these people that are living wholehearted lives, and it's becoming less excruciating. Let me give you hope if you're like me. It becomes less excruciating because the rewards are so great on the other side of it. But it is easy to fall back into the habit of stuffing things and not being vulnerable. But the more I do it, the easier it gets. But for these people that were living wholehearted lives and had real connection and felt like they were loved and belonged with people, they didn't see it as something comfortable, like, oh, it's so easy, or they didn't see it as excruciating, like I have seen it in the past. To them, they thought that it was just necessary. It's necessary to live life. You had to have the willingness to do something where there's no guarantees, Some examples of that people gave through the studies were waiting for a phone call from your doctor after getting tests, There's no guarantees, right? Waiting, having to ask your spouse for help when you're newly married because you're sick, putting yourself out there, showing yourself weak. Initiating sex with your spouse. That was a big one of made people feel vulnerable because of that fear of rejection. We live in a vulnerable world. We're always going to be exposed to it. And the reason that there's such a huge group of people that don't live actually true, authentic, vulnerable lives and don't have that connection is because we've learned wrong ways to deal with it, right? And to the vulnerabilities. One of the biggest ones is we numb grief. And so a lot of times that's one of the big issues in marriages, like addictions, right? But it doesn't have to just be addictions, but we numb by, food or alcohol or books even, novels or drugs, whatever it is. And the scientific fact is that you can't numb selective emotions. So what happens is you feel loneliness, grief, shame, depression, and then you go, the way that Brene said it is you eat a banana nut muffin and drink a glass of wine or whatever, right? But that numbs all of the emotions. And whether it doesn't have to be an addiction for you, it can be something, like I said, like novels, movies, something where you check out of the reality that your life is, right? You numb that feeling of vulnerability, instead of, actually facing up to what is out there, the call from the doctor, having an honest conversation with your spouse, you just slip it under the rug and go on. But it's just a vicious cycle that comes around and we numb it. So how do we live another way? What is the way that the people that are living wholeheartedly and are being vulnerable, you have to let yourselves be seen for who you really are. And that's so important with your spouse. So important. It's exhausting. I've done it. It's exhausting to pretend to be a way that you're not. I mean, am I the only one? It's exhausting and it's draining, and it will drain your life and your marriage of joy. Let yourself love with your whole hearts, even when there's no guarantee with each other. Practice gratitude. That's something that I am bad at as well. I think it and I feel it. I'm very bad at saying it. I've had to train myself. My go-to has been to react when things are wrong. So I go into action mode to fix things when they're wrong. But when things are going good, I'm like, okay, going good. Watch out. What's the next wrong thing? What's the next wrong thing? Instead of stopping and acknowledging, Justin, I really appreciate this about you. I really love how you've been doing this. Or with my kids. I mean, this applies to your kids too. This is a marriage conference, and it applies to all your relationships. But so practice gratitude and joy even in those moments of uncertainty. When you're waiting for the call, when you're trying to do something that's putting yourself out there, be grateful that you have the opportunity to do that. You're alive and your heart's beating, and you have the opportunity to do that, and believe that you're enough, because you are. Exactly how you are, you're enough. So I'm going to play this little video just to have another perspective from some other people besides my voice that's also about vulnerability.
Hey there, today we're going to talk about vulnerability.
Now, what does that mean? I know if you think about some of the older TV shows where the father was shown as like the strong male figure, and there was a lot of real men don't cry and that sort of thing. And well, there's one level of that is kind of social pressure for public. It's really dangerous if you take that same mentality into your marriage.
Right.
Because in order to have a deep marriage and that deep intimacy, we need to have that open, honest relationship with our spouse. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to not only celebrate good things together and be happy, but share when we have those low moments, be able to cry mm-hmm. together, be able to process the tough things together.
Yeah, our fears, our struggles, mm-hmm. Those need to be things that we can talk with our spouse about, because that's going to increase that emotional intimacy, and that's going to make us feel closer and feel more like a team, where we can work through things as a team and together.
And there will be those difficult things in life, and it's so much easier to work through them mm-hmm. when you can share your emotions, share your struggles right. with your spouse, and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this, or I saw this thing today and it just made me really sad, and you can comfort each other, but mm-hmm. you only get that benefit by being able to be open.
Right.
And I know for me that didn't really come naturally at all. You grew up having mm-hmm. emotions talked about, and for me, I'm not even sure it was my parents that taught me this, but I think I just got the idea from a young age that real men don't cry, stuff your emotions, and present a bold front and get on with life.
Well, I think sometimes it's easier to stuff, at least in the moment.
So much easier.
It's so much easier to stuff because it's like, okay, we don't have to deal with it. We can just, put it under the rug, the dust under the rug, just hide it. We don't need to discuss it. We'll deal with it. Well, here's the problem with that mentality. The more that we sweep under the rug, the taller that rug is going to get, and it's subtle. Right? It's super subtle. So, because dust isn't, like a box or anything, it's going to slowly build and build and build and build. And then eventually, years down the road, you're going to start tripping over it. And when you trip over it, that's when you start having really serious arguments with your spouse and really serious difficulties that you're working through because you haven't done the work to begin with. You've just been stuffing.
Yeah, you've let it build. And I will say that this isn't even just situational stuff. It could be something in your marriage. Some of the biggest marriage issues start so small.
So small.
Like, you think of affairs. Affairs aren't something that just happen like that. There's something that's years and years and years of building up and not being vulnerable and not sharing life with each other.
Not having that emotional intimacy.
Yeah, the emotional connection. And
yeah,
the biggest way to get the emotional connection is just to share. Even if you're struggling with something as a couple, talk about it, process through it. There are so many difficult things that couples go through every day that you wouldn't necessarily know about. I'm not going to list them, but if you've been married, you can understand what some of those things are that feel not good.
Right.
So just talk about them, process through, and I think you might see that your spouse is feeling similar to you.
It takes more courage to talk about it and to work through it, and more strength to do so than to just stuff it or put it under the rug or just not deal with it, because eventually you're going to have to deal with it.
Right.
Eventually you're going to have to deal with the hurt, the struggle, your feelings. Because there's only so far that balloon's going to blow up before it's going to pop.
Yep. So just deflate it just a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
It's easier that way.
Right.
So take some time this week and talk about it. Have a conversation. Be open with each other about a struggle. See if you can find something that you're struggling with and share openly back and forth with your spouse.
Yeah.
And just start building that connection. Talk about your feelings. Guys, I know this is uncomfortable, but if you really want to connect with your spouse, it's huge. I would strongly, strongly recommend be vulnerable. Let your wife see you. Let your wife see the side of you that you keep hidden. Even if she's the only one you ever let see it, start there. Let her see it and work to build that relationship and build that trust. It is so amazing to be able to have somebody that can see you and understand where you're struggling, where you're sad, the times that have made you cry, and not judge you for it.
Right. And I know we're talking, you've mentioned the men, but that goes for women too. Because I know sometimes it can be that a woman doesn't want to engage in the emotions, or that she stuffs it. And just as a quick aside, emotional intimacy leads to great sex.
Yep.
So that's kind of where it starts. Because when we're emotionally really, really connected, then sex is awesome.
It's easier to feel safe with your spouse and to care about them and not have any walls.
Right, exactly.
Now, I would say one more thing. If you're the person listening to somebody who's sharing these tough things, let them share. Don't judge them. Don't berate them. But just try and understand where they are and be compassionate and caring for them.
Right. So kind of going off of that, one thing I would even think about, even just kind of as a metaphor for your walls. What does your wall look like with your spouse? Is your wall just a tent? Is your wall a castle? Do you have a moat around your castle?
Little
crocodiles in there. How built up are your walls around your spouse? And start taking that down little by little.
All right. Wasn't that some good stuff on vulnerability? Yeah. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to be closing for the night, closing a couple minutes early, but I just want to encourage you guys as you go. Number one, if you're interested in any of the books that we got, they're $10 each, and we'll have somebody back there to take your money, or you can bring money tomorrow if you'd like to get one of those books. Number two, we do have a couple of spots left if you know somebody who'd want to come to the rest of the conference tomorrow and Saturday. So we'd love to have a couple more spots filled up, but you can see some empty chairs, and that's because just a couple people ended up not being able to come. So invite somebody and bring them with you. You can, sedate them and put them in the trunk of your car. I mean, I'm always pro that. Whatever it takes, right? So get them here, and then the last thing is we are starting at 6:30 p.m. tomorrow night. Cool. You guys can stay as long as you want, chat, get to know some people, and then we will see you back here at 6:30. Thank you for coming to the first night. See ya.